Welcome to Attic Static. Tonight we have 19 stories for you, including the Executor's Burden, the Precursor of the Silo, the Upward Fall of the Suture-Witch, and more. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the rain carry you. The Executor's Burden. I stood before the gathering and cleared my throat, the heavy parchment of the final while trembling slightly in my grip. My task was simple, to read the final testament of Elias Thorne, a man who lived in solitude until his final breath. I had expected a list of inheritances, perhaps a few sentimental notes. Instead, I found a narrative of a man living in constant, creeping anticipation. The will began with the sinkhole at the edge of his estate, a jagged limestone maw that seemed to swallow the afternoon light. Elias described the descent into the dark as a journey into a waiting room. It was there, he wrote, the mouth of the earth, waiting for a guest who never quite arrived until I did. The horror of his life was the matter of the arrival. For 40 years, Elias lived with a peculiar phenomenon. Something was always waiting for him at his destinations. It was never a person, but a presence that preceded him, a phantom host arriving at his appointments exactly 3 minutes before he did. He wrote of finding a seat already occupied by a subtle indentation in the grass. In the study, a book set open to the middle page. As years bled into decades, the arrival sharpened. It was no longer a mere mark, it was a physical presence lacking a permanent shape. He called it the Muffled One. It was a sprawling, porous mass of packing foam, the size of a boulder, with a velvety texture like a bruised plum. It lacked a face, possessing instead a shifting topography of pockmarks and bubbles. Its most haunting quality was its voice. It didn't speak with a tongue, it squeaked. It was the sound of air forced through 1,000 tiny pores, a rhythmic, wet friction like a voice struggling to remember its vowels. Squeak hush, yo, squeak v. It would murmur. Elias spent his twilight years terrified. The Muffled One was closing the distance. It was no longer just waiting at his appointments. It was arriving at his bed, his chair, and eventually, his very shadow. He wrote of the night it reached his bedside. He had fallen asleep in the silence, and at 3 a.m., he heard the first squeak. It was soft, like a thumb pressing into a sponge. He opened his eyes to find the foam mass hovering over his chest. It was reacting to him, mimicking the rhythm of his breathing, its bubbles expanding and contracting in a clumsy, desperate synchronization. The foam hung heavy in the air, smelling of old dust and crushed velvet. It would wait for him to wake, then offer a lingering squeak that vibrated against his ribs, the sound of a guest who had finally found their seat and was waiting for the host to notice. By the final page, Elias's handwriting became frantic. He described the ultimate realization. The Muffled One wasn't just arriving at his appointments, it was arriving at his existence, claiming the space he occupied. The sinkhole wasn't just a hole, it was the Muffled One's home, slowly pulling the rest of the world into its porous, squeaking embrace. I finished the final line and looked up at the audience, my voice a bare whisper. The will ended with a final instruction for his belongings, but the last sentence was a personal note, scribbled in the margin. Do not be alarmed when you hear the squeak behind you, for the Muffled One has finally decided that your life is the appointment it has been waiting for. As I closed the parchment, a faint, wet squeak echoed from the corner of the hall. A soft, spongy pressure pressed against the back of my neck. I stood before the gathering and cleared my throat, the heavy parchment of the final while trembling slightly in my grip. The Precursor of the Silo. I never expected the silence of a Cold War missile silo to feel heavy, but on that Tuesday night, it felt suffocating. I was the lone sentry on the night watch at Site 9, a concrete tomb buried deep beneath the rolling hills of the Eastern Plateau. My job was simple: monitor the telemetry, ensure the pressure valves remained steady, and watch the massive, rusted titanium noses of the missiles sleep in their cradles. The air smelled of old grease and ozone. At first, the solitude was a comfort, but by 2 a.m., the atmosphere shifted. It started with the hum of the ventilation fans, a rhythmic, metallic wheeze that seemed to pulse with a heartbeat of its own. Then I noticed the movement in the peripheral vision of the main gallery. It wasn't a physical object, but a distortion in the air, ripple of density that moved just before I did. I took a step forward toward the primary launcher, and a fraction of a second before my boot hit the floor, a faint, velvet-soft thud echoed in the same spot. It was as if something were walking exactly one step ahead of me, inhabiting the space I was about to claim. I froze. The silence returned, thick and expectant. I moved again, this time with deliberate caution. Every time I reached for a lever, a ghostly weight seemed to press against my hand a heartbeat before my skin made contact. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical presence. I began to realize that I wasn't alone in the silo. Something was inhabiting the space, but it was operating on a temporal offset. It was a second shadow, a being that lived in the immediate future of my own movements. To see it was difficult because it existed in the about to be. It manifested as a shimmering, translucent veil of amber light, shaped like a hunched, multi-jointed creature with a torso that seemed to stretch and fold like pleated silk. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense, but rather a series of vibrating, crystalline ridges that hummed when it sensed my proximity. As I moved toward the control hub, the amber veil moved with me, always a heartbeat ahead. It reached out with 3 heavy, bulbous limbs that ended in smooth, rounded pads instead of claws. I could see it pulse with a soft radiance, its body rippling like water whenever I moved faster. The further down the silo I went, the more frantic the movement became. It wasn't just preceding me, it was reacting to my intent. If I thought about turning left, the amber entity was already halfway there, its silk-like body swaying. The tension in my chest tightened. I felt like a dancer following a lead who was always just a pulse ahead, trying to catch up to a rhythm that had already been set. I reached the lowest level, the heart of the silo where the main nuclear warhead sat. The air here was colder, and the amber entity grew larger, its pleated skin expanding until it filled the corridor. I stopped completely, my breath hitching in my throat. For 3 seconds, there was absolute stillness. Then, the amber veil moved forward into the space directly in front of my face, expanding until it touched my nose. It wasn't just ahead of me anymore. It was about to become me. I reached out a trembling hand, and just as my fingers were about to close around the shimmering silk of its body, it flickered. It didn't just move forward, it surged. The entity elongated, its 3 limbs stretching out to wrap around my own, as if it were trying to pull my physical body into its future state. I felt a sudden, sharp tug on my shoulders, a sensation of being pulled into a vacuum. The amber light flared into a brilliant gold, then collapsed inward. In that final moment, the entity didn't just precede my movement, it claimed it. The silence of the silo returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of a space that had been fully occupied. I stood in the center of the room, my hand still outstretched, feeling the faint, lingering warmth of the amber silk against my skin. The shadow had finally caught up, and now I could feel it waiting just behind my eyelids, ready to move the next time I dared to blink. The upward fall of the Suture-Witch. The airboat engine had finally sputtered into silence, leaving the boardwalk in a vacuum of heavy, humid quiet. I stood alone on the weathered timber, the fog hugging the swamp water like a wet shroud. The mist was thick enough to swallow my own feet, yet when I looked up, the sky was a vast, velvet expanse of silver. The problem with the swamp isn't the water or the mud, it is the orientation of the sky. Most people think of the stars as hanging above us, but if you stare at them long enough, the gravity begins to lie. You feel the floor beneath your boots soften, and suddenly, you aren't standing on the wood anymore. You are falling. Not down toward the muck, but upward into the infinite, a slow-motion tumble toward the constellations. I felt my stomach lurch as the boardwalk began to feel like a receding shore. This is where the troubleshooting begins. If you feel the upward pull, you must first locate the source. The source is not a sound, but a texture. From the fog emerged a mass of woven geometry. It was a creature stitched together from the remnants of 1,000 lives. Tufts of tangled hair, some copper bright and others dull as soot, were woven into a thick, shaggy pelt. Embedded within this mane were thousands of fingernails, each one polished by time and arranged in overlapping scales like the shell of a prehistoric nautilus. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Instead, It had a cluster of eyes arranged in a spiral, each one a different shade of amber or moss. It moved with a rhythmic, clicking sound, the fingernails clinking against one another like a rain of porcelain beads. I tried to step back, but the upward fall intensified. The boardwalk was falling away from me, and the stars were rushing toward my face. To stabilize, I had to execute the next step in the logic, acknowledge the stitcher. I took a breath, the air tasting of salt and old silk. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely cutting through the damp air. The creature didn't speak, but the hair on its back began to ripple, swaying as if caught in a breeze that only it could feel. It drifted toward me, its fingernail scales shimmering. It reached out a limb, not a hand, but a heavy, braided appendage of hair tipped with a single, oversized thumbnail. It touched my forehead. The sensation was cold, a sharp prick of recognition. Now, the third step of the flowchart, the alignment. I had to match my internal rhythm to its clicking pulse. I closed my eyes, letting the sensation of falling upward wash over me until I stopped fighting it. I stopped trying to stay on the ground. In my mind, I accepted that the ground was a memory and the sky was my destination. The creature leaned in, its spiral of eyes focusing on me. It opened a mouth hidden beneath a thicket of blonde hair and released a hum that vibrated in my teeth. The upward fall hit its peak. For a second, I was suspended in the middle of the air, the boardwalk a tiny brown strip below, the swamp a distant memory. I was suspended between the dirt and the zenith. The stitcher pulsed once, and the gravity inverted again, slamming me back down onto the timber with a dull thud. The fog rushed in to reclaim the space. I was back on the boardwalk, the airboat a speck in the distance. The creature was gone, but the scent of wet hair remained. I stood up, my knees trembling, feeling the solid wood beneath my feet. The troubleshooting was complete. The logic had closed. I looked back at the door where I had first entered the swamp, a heavy oaken portal that stood inexplicably in the middle of the planks. I walked toward it, expecting to find my way back to the world of the living. I reached out, my hand trembling, and pushed. The door swung open to reveal the same fog-drowned swamp, the same boardwalk, and the same heavy oaken door facing me from the other side. I realized then that the door didn't lead forward. It only served to reset the loop of my own drifting soul. I stepped through, and as I did, I felt a single fingernail brush against my neck. From behind. The Ledger of the Lean Hunger. The air inside the hay barn always smelled of toasted grain and the warm, musky breath of newborns. During the peak of lambing season, the silence is never truly silent. It is filled with the rhythmic chewing of ewes and the occasional, muffled bleat of a lamb finding its feet. I spent those nights alone, my lantern swinging from a rusted hook, carving my way through the golden stacks of hay. It was during the third night of the frost that I found the ledger. It sat atop a bale of clover, a heavy, leather-bound book with pages that felt like pressed velvet. On the cover, in gold leaf, were the words, "Lost and Found." I assumed it belonged to the farmer, a simple record of misplaced tools or stray sheep, but as I opened it, the handwriting began to change. The first page listed a silver thimble and a small brass key. The second page listed a thimble of silver and a key of small brass. They were the same items, just rearranged in a poetic, almost hungry sequence. I laughed softly, the sound echoing against the timber beams. A bit redundant, isn't it? I whispered to the empty space. The barn didn't answer, but the ledger did. As I turned the page, the ink seemed to ripple. The third page held, a breath of cold and a cold breath. I looked around. The air was freezing, but the hay was warm. I felt a strange prickle on my neck, the sensation of being watched by something that wasn't a sheep. That was when I heard the purr. It wasn't the vibration of a cat. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to emanate from the very rafters, like a distant engine humming underwater. Then, the crouched thing emerged from the shadows of the loft. It didn't walk so much as it flowed. It was a hunched creature, its body covered in overlapping scales that looked like weathered copper coins. It had no distinct tail, but its spine ended in a cluster of soft, pulsing bristles. Its face was a smooth oval, lacking a nose or ears, dominated by a wide, horizontal slit for a mouth that remained closed until it felt my presence. It didn't have eyes in the traditional sense. Instead, it had a series of glowing, amber pits arranged in a semicircle across its forehead. It moved toward me, its scales clinking like a handful of change being poured onto a stone floor. As it drew closer, the purr grew louder, vibrating in my chest cavity. It didn't want my time, or my attention, or even my memories. It wanted the things I had never once wanted. It leaned in, its copper scales brushing against my shoulder, and the slit of its mouth parted. It didn't eat my hunger. It ate the things I had forgotten to desire. It took the urge to travel to a city I'd never visited. It took the craving for a cello I'd never owned. It took the sudden, inexplicable wish to see the ocean in winter. I felt a strange hollowness in my chest, a vacuum where my secret, unvoiced longings used to live. I looked at the ledger again. The pages were turning themselves now, the ink flowing like water. A new entry appeared, the desire for a new name, and a new name desired. I felt the creature's weight shift. It was closer now, its amber pits glowing with a fierce intensity. It was pulling the very essence of potential out of my soul. I reached out to touch its smooth face, and for a moment, I felt a surge of immense satisfaction, as if 1,000 small doors in my mind had finally clicked shut. It was a delicious, terrifying theft. The creature leaned its forehead against mine, and the purr reached a crescendo, a vibrating roar of contentment. It let out a final, tiny puff of steam from its mouth, then retreated into the shadows of the loft. The barn fell silent, the only sound being the steady breathing of the lambs. I picked up the ledger and flipped to the very last page. The ink was still wet, forming the final pair of entries. The owner of the want and the want of the owner. I realized then that the creature hadn't just taken my desires, it had taken the part of me that knew how to want them. I looked at the creature's spot. In the rafters, where it sat perfectly still, its copper scales dulling in the moonlight. I knew exactly what I would do tomorrow, and yet I no longer cared to do it. The Unsaved Contact. To the night shift team, if you find yourself on the late watch at the Grandview, the pool area is usually your sanctuary of silence, but it is also where the rules of the hotel slightly warp. Last Tuesday, I was tasked with the final sweep of the indoor pool long after the guests had retreated to their beds. The water was a still, turquoise sheet, perfectly flat, reflecting the overhead halogen lights like a sheet of frozen glass. It was roughly 2 a.m. I stood on the tiled edge, the air smelling of chlorine and damp concrete, listening to the rhythmic drip of a leaky faucet in the far corner. It was a lonely, peaceful sound until my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out to check the time, and my heart did a strange little skip. On the screen, an incoming call was vibrating. The name of the caller was blank. No name, no number, just a single, blinking void of a contact that hadn't been there when I woke up. I stared at it, confused, because I knew for a fact that I had never saved a blank contact into my phone. I swiped to answer, but there was no voice. Instead, there was a sound, a sharp, metallic click. It was the exact sound of a heavy door latching shut. It was a precise, dry noise, like a mahogany door swinging into a frame and snapping into place. I looked around, confused. The heavy fire door at the far end of the pool was wide open, yet I hadn't moved a muscle. I laughed softly, thinking it was just the building settling. I hung up. Then, the phone buzzed again. Click, the sound came from directly behind my left shoulder. I spun around, my breath hitching. The fire door was still open, but the water in the pool had rippled as if something heavy had just entered the surface. I stayed perfectly still, my thumb hovering over the screen. 3 minutes passed in a suffocating silence. Then, the phone vibrated a third time. Click, this time, the sound didn't come from the door. It came from the water right in front of me. I peered into the turquoise surface. A ripple expanded outward, but there was no splash. Just a smooth, expanding circle of movement. I took a step back, my heel clicking against the tile. The phone buzzed again. Click, the sound was closer now, almost audible in my own ear, yet I saw nothing. Then, the phone began to ring continuously, a steady, vibrating hum that seemed to vibrate against my palm. I looked up and saw it. It wasn't a ghost or a shadow. It was a creature perched on the very edge of the deep end. It had the body of a large, hunched lizard, but its skin was covered in overlapping scales that looked like hammered copper. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Instead, it had a wide, horizontal slit for a mouth and a single, oversized amber bulb where a forehead should be. It didn't have eyes, but the bulb pulsed with a soft, golden light that illuminated the ripples in the water. It didn't move toward me. It simply sat there, its copper scales shimmering. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to move, to run, to hide. But the phone buzzed again. Click, this time, the sound was the loudest yet. The creature didn't just make the noise, it opened its mouth wide, and the click resonated from its throat. The amber bulb on its head flared bright, then dimmed. I realized then that the creature wasn't just making the sound of a door closing. It was mimicking the sensation of a door closing into the space between us. I took a tentative step forward, my hand reaching out. The creature tilted its torso, its copper scales clinking like coins. It opened its mouth again, and a second click echoed. This time, the sound was accompanied by a faint scent of old parchment and rain. I felt a strange pull, as if the creature were inviting me into its own internal space. I finally reached out, my fingers inches from its copper hide. Just as I was about to touch it, the phone gave one final, violent buzz. Click, the creature vanished instantly, not fading or moving, but simply ceasing to exist in the physical space. The pool became still again. The air grew cold. I looked down at my phone. The blank contact was gone, replaced by a single new entry at the top of my list. It was named the guest, and underneath it, in small text, was the number of seconds it had been waiting for me to answer. The surplus of the closet. I suppose I should start by explaining why I am speaking to these four walls. It is a habit of the displaced, the need to externalize the internal until the air feels less heavy. I live in a house that is structurally sound, yet I find myself spending most of my time in the walk-in closet at the end of the hallway. It is a peculiar space. According to the blueprints of the house, it should be a modest 6 by 6 foot cube, but when I step inside, it feels cavernous. It stretches back further than the floor plan allows, a deepening well of cedar-scented air and hanging wool. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the architecture, a spatial anomaly where the walls decided to lie to the ceiling. But then, the geometry began to change. It started with the sounds. Not footsteps, but a laugh. It was a low, melodic trill that arrived just before I entered the room, as if it were anticipating my arrival. It would echo in the silence for several minutes after I stepped back out into the bedroom, a lingering residue of amusement that didn't belong to me. The entity isn't a shape I could easily name at first. It is a creature of texture and rhythm. It has skin like weathered suede, the color of a bruised plum, and a face that is almost perfectly smooth except for a jagged, vertical seam running from its forehead to its chin. It doesn't have many teeth. It has a row of blunt, porcelain-like studs along its gums. For months, I ignored it. I assumed it was just a whimsical tenant of the deeper dimensions of the closet. But the suspicion began to gnaw at me last Tuesday. I was reaching for a heavy-knit sweater when I noticed my hand. I looked at my thumb, then at the space just inches away. I felt the familiar texture of my own skin, but when I reached out to touch the door frame, I felt a sensation of almost. It was as if the friction of the wood didn't quite catch on my skin. I began to notice it everywhere. When I held a book, the weight felt slightly offset. When I ate an apple, the crunch felt a millisecond delayed. It was the tactile feedback of the world that was failing me. I started to realize that my fingerprints were no longer perfectly my own. They were becoming slightly rounded at the edges, as if they were being smoothed over by a damp cloth. I began to fear that the closet was stealing my physical properties, one sensation at a time. The entity was closer now. I could hear its breath, a rhythmic, what wheeze that sounded like a bellows working in a forge. One night, I sat perfectly still in the center of the closet, the deep shadows of the extended room swallowing the light of my single lantern. The laugh came first, a sharp, staccato burst of joy. Then, the entity emerged from the deepest corner. It didn't walk, it unfolded. It moved like a piece of origami opening up, its suede skin rippling. It didn't have eyes in the traditional sense, but rather two glowing indentations that pulsed with a soft, amber light. It reached out a heavy, padded limb and pressed it against my chest. I expected to feel the warmth of its touch, but instead, I felt a strange, hollow vibration. It wasn't just touching me, it was trying to calibrate me. It was trying to find where my body ended and its influence began. It leaned in, its vertical seam widening like a blooming flower, and let out that signature laugh, the one that arrives before the joke. It took a long, shuddering breath and then pressed its smooth forehead against mine. In that moment of contact, I felt my own identity slip. My fingerprints didn't just feel smooth, they felt repurposed. I looked down at my hand in the dim light and saw that the ridges of my fingertips had been replaced by the same blunt, porcelain-like studs as the entity's teeth. My skin was no longer a map of my own history. I stood up, my movements feeling heavier, more deliberate. The entity retreated into the deep shadows, its amber pulses fading until it was just a texture in the dark. I walked out of the closet and into the bedroom, the silence now absolute. I reached out to touch the bedside table, but my hand felt alien. I realized that the entity wasn't just living in the closet, it was slowly replacing me, piece by piece, until there would be nothing left of the original owner, but a shell of perfect, stolen geometry. I reached for the door handle, but as my hand closed around it, I realized the sensation of grip was now entirely different. My fingers were no longer mine, they were merely the tools it had decided to borrow. The precipitation of the portrait. I am submitting this claim to the estate of the Willow Creek Nursing Home not for a structural failure of the masonry, but for a localized atmospheric anomaly that redefined the residents' experience of the night shift. It began on a Tuesday in the East Wing Day Room, a space usually reserved for the afternoon bustle of residents and the hum of the radiator. By 2 a.m., however, the room became the site of a quiet, inexplicable phenomenon. At the center of the room hung a single, oversized sheet of parchment, held by a simple wooden frame. On it, a child had drawn a family, a mother, a father, a dog, and a small boy. It was a simple charcoal sketch, yet it possessed an odd weight to it, as if the lines were still settling into the grain of the paper. The first night, the nursing home staff noticed the first change. A new figure appeared in the drawing, a tall, thin woman with hair like tangled copper wire. She stood next to the father. The next night, a small bird was added to the mother's shoulder. By the third night, a tiny house with a chimney appeared in the bottom corner. The residents began to whisper that the drawing was growing, but it was the atmosphere of the room that truly began to shift. The air grew thick, tasting of wet stone and ozone. Then came the most peculiar occurrence, the rain. It did not fall from the ceiling, nor did it mist from the walls. Instead, a constant, localized downpour began to strike the drawing itself. It was a tiny, vertical cylinder of rain, exactly 3 feet in diameter, falling from a point in the empty air. It rained only on the portrait. The water didn't splash outward, it seemed to be absorbed by the charcoal lines, making the drawing look perpetually damp and saturated. The residents found themselves mesmerized. Mrs. Gable, who sat in her armchair every night, would watch the rain fall for hours. "It feels like it's thinking," she told me during my final inspection. The drawing was no longer a static image, it was a living ecosystem. Each night, a new member of the family joined the group. A grandmother with a crown of lilies, a twin set of kittens, a tall man holding a lantern. But with every new addition, the rain began to behave strangely. It started to drift. One night, the cylinder of rain shifted from the portrait to the head of the youngest resident, a boy named Leo. The rain fell only on his hair, turning it into a sodden, dripping mess while the rest of his body remained perfectly dry. He didn't mind. He sat in the center of the room, smiling as the rhythmic pitter-patter echoed against the silence of the ward. On the 10th night, the rain moved again. It traveled across the room like a wandering spotlight, falling on a chair, then a vase, then a terrified nurse who had stopped to watch. The water was cool, smelling of mountain mist and old memories. It didn't make the floor wet, The moisture seemed to vanish the moment it hit the surface, as if the air were drinking it. By the 14th night, the drawing was crowded, a sprawling masterpiece of charcoal figures, all interconnected by lines of movement. The rain began to move faster, dancing across the room in a frantic, swirling pattern, eventually settling on the center of the large dining table. It stayed there for an hour, a miniature waterfall in a dry room. But then, the water began to change color. It turned a deep, bruised purple, and the drawing started to tremble. The figures on the paper began to lean toward the edges of the parchment, their charcoal limbs stretching as if trying to tear through the frame. The rain intensified, becoming a rhythmic, violent drumbeat that filled the hall. Then, at 3:15 a.m., the rain stopped entirely. The room fell into a heavy, expectant silence. When the morning shift arrived, they found the drawing completely transformed. The charcoal figures were gone, replaced by a single, large, wet smudge in the center of the page. The rain had moved one final time, and it hadn't landed on a person or a piece of furniture. It had settled directly onto the floor, creating a perfect, shimmering puddle in the shape of a human footprint. The drawing was no longer a family portrait. It was a record of someone who had finally stepped off the page and into the room. The floor was dry everywhere else, but that single footprint remained, deep and shimmering, as if something heavy had just finished walking through our world and was still waiting for us to notice. I am submitting this claim to the estate of the Willow Creek Nursing Home not for a structural failure of the masonry, but for a localized atmospheric anomaly that redefined the residents' experience of the night shift. The echo of the maze. We remember it as the day the geography of the world decided to fold in on itself. It began at the edge of the Great Reach, a sprawling corn maze that stood like a golden fortress against the October sky. We were a group of friends, a collective of voices wandering through the stalks, feeling the familiar rhythm of the wind. But as the sun dipped toward the horizon, the air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and toasted grain. We weren't just walking through the corn, we were walking through a loop. Every time we turned a corner, we found ourselves facing the same towering pillar of maze, yet the path would shift. The turn that led left a moment ago suddenly led right. The exit seemed to retreat like a shy animal. By the time the shadows stretched into long, distorted fingers, the panic began to set in. We were lost in a labyrinth that refused to be solved. It was then that the first repetition occurred. We found a specific patch of corn where the stalks were bent in a perfect, sweeping arc, as if a giant hand had brushed them. We laughed, noting the detail. 5 minutes later, we turned the corner and saw it again, the same arc, but this time, the stalks were bent in the opposite direction. The day began to stutter. We felt the weight of the repetition in our chests, a sense of déjà vu that sharpened into a prickle of unease. Then, the sound started. It wasn't a rustle of wind or a chirp of a cricket. It was a hum, a low vibration that seemed to emanate from the dirt beneath our boots. We stopped. From the dense greenery ahead, a voice spoke. It wasn't a distant call. It was close enough to feel the warmth of the breath. "Are you lost?" it asked. The voice was perfect. It was my own voice, the exact pitch, the slight rasp on the vowels, the tiny hesitation before the final word. It was the sound of my own thoughts projected outward, as if my shadow had finally found its tongue. We froze, our hearts hammering against our ribs. We expected a person to step out, but there was only the swaying corn. Then another voice joined. "We are searching for the center," it said, this time in your voice, and then mine again. It was a conversation between me and the maze, held in the singular key of my own throat. The day began to rearrange itself with violent precision. We saw the same cluster of 3 withered stalks we had passed 10 minutes prior, but now they were arranged in a triangle instead of a line. The exit was no longer a distant goal, it was a ghost, haunting the periphery of our vision. Every time we entered a new corridor, the proportions of the maze changed. The stalks grew taller, then shorter, then thicker, as if the maze were inhaling and exhaling. The voice grew more frequent, more insistent. It began to repeat our own memories back to us, but with a slight, mocking twist. "Remember the blue bike?" it whispered in my voice. I hadn't thought of the bike in years, yet the voice spoke it as if it were a secret just shared. The blue bike with the broken bell, it corrected, and we all gasped. The repetition was no longer just a visual trick, it was a temporal erosion. We were living the same day over and over, but each iteration stripped away a layer of reality. The colors became more vivid, the air tasted of copper, and the voices began to overlap until 3 different versions of my own voice were speaking at once, creating a haunting harmony of me. We began to run, desperate to reach the center, but the center was moving. It was a shifting point of gravity. Just as we reached the very middle, the stalk suddenly collapsed inward, folding like a closing fan. We were standing in a small, circular clearing of perfect, white corn. The voices fell silent. The repetition stopped. The maze was no longer a labyrinth, it was a finished sentence. We stood there, breathless, as the last of the light drained from the sky. Then, from the very center of the white corn, a figure finally emerged. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Its head was a smooth, seamless sphere of polished amber. It didn't have eyes, but it had a wide, crescent-shaped mouth that pulsed with a soft, internal glow. It moved toward us with a fluid, gliding motion, its body a shimmering weave of silk and corn husk. It stopped just inches from my face. It didn't move, didn't blink, and didn't breathe. It simply waited. Then it spoke one final time, using my voice, but with a clarity that felt like a physical touch. "I have been waiting for you to finish the day," it said. We realized then that the maze wasn't a place we were walking through. It was a memory the entity was trying to build. The entity reached out a hand, a limb made of interlocking porcelain segments, and touched my forehead. The moment its skin met mine, the maze vanished, and we were left standing in a silent, empty field under a moonless sky, realizing that the entity was now standing behind us, mimicking my every breath perfectly. The last will of the constant watcher. The city didn't die all at once. It surrendered in waves. First, the street lamps flickered out, then the hum of the refrigerator ceased, and finally, the heavy, velvet weight of total darkness pressed against the windows of the Crisis Hotline Bureau. I sat at desk 4, the only light coming from a row of flickering emergency candles that cast dancing, elongated shadows against the peeling wallpaper. Usually, the office was a symphony of overlapping voices, but now it was a vacuum. My only companion was the telephone, which felt like a heavy, archaic umbilical cord connecting me to a world that had suddenly gone silent. I had been told to keep the lines open, even if no one called, just to provide a sense of presence for the people trapped in the dark. I gripped the receiver, my knuckles white, feeling the strange pulse of the city's heartbeat slowed to a crawl. Then, the first call came through. It wasn't a voice, but a wet, rhythmic clicking, like a tongue tapping against the roof of a mouth. I leaned into the mouthpiece, whispering, "Hello? Is someone there?" The clicking stopped. A voice, dry as parchment and layered with the texture of grinding stones, replied, "I am inheriting your silence." I frowned, wondering if it was a joke from a lonely neighbor. Then a second call joined the first. It was a hum, a vibrating low note that made the pens on my desk dance. "And I am inheriting your breath," the second voice sighed. I felt a prickle of unease at the base of my neck. I realized then that the callers weren't just speaking, they were claiming things. I reached for my notepad, my hand trembling slightly. "What else do you claim?" I asked. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Then, a third voice, crystalline and sharp, whispered, "I am inheriting the way you look at me." I froze. I hadn't realized I was being watched, but in the blackout, the sensation of a gaze became physical, like a warm weight pressing against my forehead. I looked up, squinting into the gloom. There was nothing there but the flickering candle flames. However, as I blinked, a sound erupted, a sudden, metallic clack from the corner of the room. It was the sound of a heavy door latching, but there were no doors in that corner, only the shadows. I turned my head, and that was when the entity revealed itself. It didn't have a head, or even a face in the traditional sense. It was a massive, hovering torso, roughly the size of a large trunk, composed entirely of hundreds of claw hands. Some were broad and flat like paddles, Others were needle-thin and curved like the horns of a ram. They were all made of a dull, tarnished brass that caught the candlelight. Most importantly, every single hand was frozen, pointing toward the exact spot where I had looked away just a second before. It didn't move with grace, it pulsed. Each time it pulsed, the hands would shift slightly, as if trying to catch up to my attention. It was a living tally of my focus. "You are giving away so much," the three voices spoke in unison, their tones blending into a haunting harmony. "Your memories, your movements, the very way your heart chooses to beat." I felt a strange sensation of subtraction. It was as if, by looking at the entity, I was losing a piece of myself. I watched as one of its larger, serrated hands swept toward me, and suddenly, the memory of my mother's face faded, leaving behind a soft, pleasant blur. I gasped, reaching out to touch the brass surface. It was cold, vibrating with a faint, rhythmic ticking that seemed to come from inside its chest. "Is it all gone?" I whispered. The entity responded by shifting its hands. A dozen of them pivoted to point directly at my own chest. "Not yet," it murmured. "I am still inheriting the way you feel about being lost." The room grew colder. The candles began to burn with a strange, bluish hue, and the shadows on the wall began to stretch toward the torso, as if being pulled into its brass orbit. I realized the entity wasn't just a collection of hands, it was a collector of the leftovers. It took the things we didn't notice, the seconds we wasted, and the glances we forgot to give. It was a scavenger of the subconscious. As the ticking grew louder, my own heart began to sync with it. My pulse slowed, matching the steady, mechanical rhythm of the brass hands. I felt my grip on the telephone loosen. I was no longer just the listener on the hotline. I was the gift. I watched as the entity expanded, its hands multiplying, branching out like a metallic forest. It reached for my hands, my feet, and the very air around my ears. I felt a final, profound sense of surrender. The voices stopped. The ticking reached a crescendo. I closed my eyes, and in that final moment of stillness, I felt the entity take the last thing I had left. It didn't just take my sight, it took the fact that I had been watching it at all. When the lights finally flickered back on, the chair was empty, the candles were spent, and the brass torso sat in the center of the room, its hundreds of hands now pointing perfectly, uniformly, at the empty space where I had once stood. The Petal Toll. 1 second. The rain is a steady hum against the windshield. The bridge stretches out ahead, a concrete ribcage over the black water. I am alone, save for the rhythmic clicking of the wipers. For minutes and 12 seconds, the first toll booth appears. It is an island of yellow light in the gloom. I slow the car. The booth is empty, but the air smells of old parchment and damp earth. 5 minutes and 45 seconds. A figure stands in the booth. It is not human, but a silhouette of pressed flowers. Its body is a dense cluster of dried lavender, rose hips, and jasmine. It doesn't move, yet it seems to vibrate with a soft, papery rustle. 6 minutes and 20 seconds. As it moves to take my coin, it sheds a few petals. They don't fall randomly. They land in a perfect pair of oval shapes on the pavement, as if two invisible feet had just stepped there. 8 minutes and 15 seconds. The car moves forward, but the flower figure is still watching. It is tall, its head a burst of withered peonies. 12 minutes and 40 seconds. The second toll booth is further ahead. The rain has thickened. The flower figure is there again. It is taller now, its petals a deeper, bruised plum color. 14 minutes and 5 seconds. I notice that the flower figure is holding something. It looks like a small, frozen moment of a child. Two twins standing side by side. They are made of the same pressed petals, but one is a vibrant, dusty gold and the other is a pale, translucent white. 16 minutes and 30 seconds. The figure raises a hand, a cluster of tiny daisies, and points at the twins. They are perfectly still, yet they seem to breathe in a way that makes their petals shiver. 18 minutes and 22 seconds. I feel a strange tug in my chest. I lean toward the window. The flower figure opens its mouth, which is a hollow center of a sunflower. A voice, sounding like dry silk rubbing against wood, echoes in the cabin. Which of the twins is the real one? 20 minutes and 10 seconds. I hesitate. The gold twin has a slight curve in its stem, a tiny crown of petals. The white twin has a slight crease, like a memory of a smile. 22 minutes and 45 seconds. I look at the gold one. It seems solid, heavy with the weight of many seasons. I look at the white one. It seems light, as if it might float away if I blinked. 24 minutes. I answer, my voice barely a whisper. The gold one. 26 minutes and 15 seconds. The flower figure shudders. A cascade of petals falls from its shoulders, hitting the dashboard like soft rain. 28 minutes and 50 seconds. The white twin begins to wilt. Its edges curl inward, turning a brittle brown. It becomes a husk, a ghost of a flower. 31 minutes and 10 seconds. The gold twin, however, begins to glow. It doesn't just stay gold. It starts to expand, its petals unfurling until they spill out of the flower figure's grasp and onto the seat of my car. 33 minutes and 40 seconds. The flower figure bows. The sunflowers in its face fold inward. It reaches out and touches my forehead with a cluster of mint leaves. 35 minutes and 20 seconds. The car feels heavier. The scent of jasmine becomes overwhelming, thick enough to taste. 38 minutes. I look back at the booth. The figure is gone. The white twin is gone. But the gold twin is still there, sitting in the passenger seat. 40 minutes and 15 seconds. It is no longer just a flower. It has started to grow, its stem winding around the headrest like a vine. 42 minutes and 30 seconds. I realize that the gold twin isn't just a twin of the white one. It is the twin of the flower figure itself. 45 minutes. I reach out to touch the gold petals. They are warm. They feel like skin, but they have the texture of velvet. 48 minutes and 10 seconds. The car begins to move again, but the engine is silent. The bridge feels longer, the water deeper. 52 minutes and 40 seconds. I look into the rearview mirror. I see my own face, but my hair is beginning to turn into tiny, delicate sprigs of rosemary. 55 minutes and 20 seconds. The gold twin speaks, its voice a dry rustle. I am the one that stays. 58 minutes. I realize the white twin didn't just wilt. It was sacrificed to make the gold one permanent. 1 hour and 2 minutes. The car reaches the end of the bridge. The city lights appear in the distance, but they're dim. 1 hour and 5 minutes. I pull into my driveway. The gold twin is still in the passenger seat, its petals perfectly preserved, glowing with a faint internal light. 1 hour and 8 minutes. I step out of the car. The air is still. I look at my hands. My fingernails are becoming tiny, hardened buds of rose. 1 hour and 10 minutes. I turn back to the car and see the gold twin has moved. It is now leaning toward me, its petals reaching out to touch my cheek. 1 hour and 12 minutes. I realize the flower figure didn't just give me a twin to choose from. It gave me a companion to carry. 1 hour and 15 minutes. I sit on my porch, the gold twin resting on my lap, its fragrance filling the night. 1 hour and 20 minutes. I notice a small, white petal fall from the gold twin's head and land on my thumb. 1 hour and 25 minutes. I look at the white twin's spot in the booth, miles away. 1 hour and 30 minutes. I realize the white twin is still there, waiting for someone else to choose the real one. 1 hour and 35 minutes. I close my eyes and feel my skin begin to harden into a woody stem. 1 hour and 40 minutes. The gold twin leans closer, its petals brushing against my ear. 1 hour and 45 minutes. It whispers the final truth in a voice of cracking bark. You are the one who is fading. 1 hour and 50 minutes. I look down at my feet. They are no longer toes, but roots, sinking deep into the floorboards of the porch, pulling me down into the wood. The inventory of the mist. Subject, patient 402. Location, St. Jude's Memorial, Ward 4. Time, 3:14 a.m. The elevator didn't just stop. It groaned, a metallic shriek that vibrated through my molars before the power died completely. I was alone, or so I thought, suspended in the velvet silence of the shaft between the 3rd and 4th floors. The emergency light flickered once, casting a jaundiced yellow glow over the linoleum, then died. I sat on the floor, my back against the warm metal wall, waiting for the jerk of movement that would signal our descent. Then came the sound. It wasn't the hum of machinery. It was a rhythmic, wet inhale. It started from the corner of the small, cot-like bed they had placed in the foyer of the stalled lift. It was a breath, heavy, deliberate, and perfectly synchronized with my own. Every time my lungs expanded, the air in the corner pulsed. Every time I exhaled, the shadow there mirrored my release. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sound persisted. "Who is there?" I whispered. The breathing didn't stop, but it became sharper. It wasn't a human breath. It sounded like air moving through a porous sponge. Then, the fog arrived. It didn't drift in from a door. It exhaled from the floorboards. It was a thick, luminous vapor the color of bruised plums. It didn't just fill the space, it moved with intent. It crawled along the ceiling first, clinging to the edges like a heavy liquid. It knew the layout of the lift, the dimensions of the corners, the exact distance between my knees and the bed frame. It flowed toward me, weaving through the air in ribbons. I watched it move. It didn't just float, it explored. It pulled in the hollow of my collarbone, then rushed outward to wrap around the metal poles of the bed. It was intelligent. It seemed to be tasting the architecture of the room. As the fog thickened, I realized it wasn't just a mist. It had texture. It felt like cool silk against my skin, but where it touched the metal, it hummed. It was a sensory map, a physical manifestation of the hospital's internal logic. I tried to stand, but the fog reacted. It surged toward my feet, pinning me to the floor as if it were trying to anchor me to the ground. It began to move faster, swirling into a cyclone of deep violet. And then, the breathing changed. It wasn't just in time with me anymore. It was leading me. Inhale. The fog pulled inward, tightening around my chest. Exhale. The fog pushed outward, expanding toward the ceiling. It was learning my rhythm, adapting its density to my pulse. It felt as though the fog was trying to become my lungs. It was searching for a way to inhabit me, to find a permanent home in a body that could move through the halls. I reached out a hand, and the fog rushed to meet my palm, swirling into a miniature whirlpool. It was dense enough to feel solid, like wet velvet. It didn't just sit there, it pulsed. "Are you coming inside?" I asked, my voice trembling. The fog responded by rushing toward the bed. It flooded the space beneath the frame, swirling in a frantic, joyous dance. That was when the real horror set in. The breathing beneath the bed grew louder, deeper, and more frantic. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a vibration. The fog wasn't just moving, it was reacting to something hidden beneath the mattress. I crawled forward on my hands and knees, the fog trailing behind me like a loyal hound. I reached the edge of the bed and peered into the dark void underneath. There was nothing there but the fog was different here. It was swirling in a perfect circle, as if something invisible were spinning it. Then, a new sound emerged. A soft, wet click. I realized the fog wasn't just reacting to my breath. It was reacting to the presence of something that had no shape. Something that lived in the gaps of the floor plan. Something that knew every hallway, every corner, and every secret pocket of the hospital. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The fog surged forward, covering my face, wrapping around my head like a warm, heavy crown. I felt a sudden, sharp pressure against my ribs, as if something invisible were trying to squeeze through my skin. I opened my eyes. The fog was no longer violet. It had turned a pale, ghostly white, and it was vibrating so fast it became a blur. Then, the breathing stopped. Silence fell over the lift. I waited for the fog to dissipate, for the pressure to release. But the fog stayed, perfectly still, hugging my body. Then I felt it. A sensation of something heavy settling into the space behind my shoulder. A weight that wasn't there a second ago. I didn't move. I didn't dare. Then, the breathing started again. It was no longer in time with me. It was coming from the space just behind my left ear, steady and rhythmic, perfectly mimicking the sound of a heart that wasn't mine. It wasn't just breathing with me anymore. It was breathing through me, and as I felt my own ribs begin to crack under the weight of its internal expansion, I realized the fog hadn't been searching for a home. It had finally found its host. I closed my eyes and felt the first shudder of the thing inside me, and then, the elevator didn't just stop. It groaned, a metallic shriek that vibrated through my molars before the power died completely. The resonance of room 402. Dear Elias, I am writing this from the bedside of Mother, though the ink is blurring because the air feels heavy, as if the atmosphere itself has become thick enough to carve with a knife. I keep trying to tell myself that the nursing home is peaceful, but the storm outside has turned the dementia wing into a labyrinth of shadows. It started on Tuesday. The rain began as a rhythmic tapping against the glass, but by Wednesday, it was a roar. The other residents are mostly asleep, yet the silence between the thunderclaps is what bothers me most. It is a heavy, expectant silence. I sat by Mother's chair and noticed the flock burst. They didn't fly. They hovered, suspended in the humid air like suspended notes on a staff. They were small, feathered things, not quite sparrows, but more like shards of burnt velvet with iridescent wings. They didn't chirp. They simply drifted, circling the bed in a slow, hypnotic orbit. Then, as the wind outside shrieked, they began to move with intention. They didn't just fly. They shifted, snapping into positions as if guided by invisible threads. They formed a shape. At first, it was a jagged triangle, then a curve, and finally, they locked into a perfect, recognizable script. They spelled out your name, Elias. It was beautiful to see your name written in feathers, but it was also unsettling, because you aren't here to see it. I wanted to reach out and touch them to see if they would stay, but the sound started then. It began as a low hum, a vibration in the floorboards that felt like a purr. Then, the feedback whine emerged. It wasn't a steady tone. It was a rising, jagged noise that felt like it was being pulled through a narrow straw. It grew louder with every passing minute, climbing in pitch until it made the hair on my arms stand up. As the whine ascended, the entity appeared from the corner of the ceiling. It didn't walk, it unfolded. It was a mass of vibrating membranes, looking like a giant, translucent accordion made of wet silk. It didn't have a face, but as the feedback whine reached a piercing crescendo, the noise folded itself into a physical mouth. It was a wide, undulating rift in the center of the silk mass, lined with rows of vibrating, hair-like cilia. The mouth didn't just open, it pulsed. It swallowed the sound, and for a moment, the room went deathly silent. The entity leaned down, its silk body rippling like water. The mouth stretched wide, showing a throat that looked like a tunnel of concentric rings. It didn't eat the flock, it inhaled them. One by one, the letters of your name were sucked into that vibrating rift, dissolving into sparks of light. I thought it was over, but then the whine changed. It stopped being a single note and became a frantic, multitonal scream. The entity began to pulse faster, its silk body expanding until it touched the walls. The walls groaned. The mouth began to widen, stretching until it was nearly the size of a carriage wheel, the cilia shivering so fast they became a blur. It wasn't just making a sound, it was trying to taste the space around it. Mother opened her eyes then. She didn't look afraid, she looked expectant. She reached out a trembling hand toward the mouth. "Is it hungry?" she whispered. The entity responded by flaring its membranes, the whine turning into a deep, resonant thrum that shook the very foundation of the ward. It lunged forward, the mouth expanding to encompass her entire hand. The sound became a physical weight, pressing against my chest. I expected it to snap her fingers off, but instead, the mouth simply hummed against her skin, vibrating with a frequency that made the air smell like ozone and old paper. Then, the whine reached its peak, a note so high it felt like a needle piercing the center of my brain. The entity froze. The silk membrane stilled. The mouth didn't close. It stayed open, a vast, yawning cavern of vibration. Then, with a final, wet suction sound, the entity exhaled a cloud of shimmering dust. The flock was gone. The whine was gone. The entity began to shrink, folding itself back into a small, motionless lump of silk on the floor. Mother sighed and closed her eyes again. I sat there for an hour, watching the dust settle on the floorboards. I wanted to believe that the entity was just a visitor, a passing ghost of the storm. I told myself it was just a beautiful, noisy thing that had come to visit us. But as the storm died down and the room fell into a true, flat silence, I realized the entity hadn't left the room entirely. It was still there, folded small, waiting. When I finally dared to look at the mouth again, I saw that it hadn't closed completely. It was still slightly parted, and from deep within that vibrating throat, a tiny, wet sound emerged, the sound of something trying to remember how to breathe. I reached out to touch it, and the silk felt warm. It was no longer a noise, it was a pulse. I realized then that it hadn't just visited us, it had been memorizing us. As I turned to leave, the mouth gave a tiny, involuntary twitch, and I heard it mimic the exact pitch of Mother's final sigh. It was waiting for me to blink so it could move again. The worst part is, I can still feel it watching me from the floor, its silent mouth twitching with the ghost of my own heartbeat. I am not alone in this room anymore. It is simply waiting for me to fall asleep so it can start the whine again. The heartbeat of the hull. The crane sits at the zenith of the city, a skeletal giant poised against the pre-dawn violet. At 300 feet up, the air is thinner, tasting of cold iron and wet dust. I am alone in the cab, the rhythmic hum of the hydraulic stabilizers providing a steady pulse that vibrates through the soles of my boots. It is a lonely, mechanical meditation. To steady my nerves during the long, grueling night shift, I have been using a small, high-sensitivity recorder. It captures the nuances of the wind, the way it whistles through the lattice of steel, but mostly, it captures my sleep talk. Last night, I woke up to a strange recording. I had muttered a single, half-conscious word, and the recorder played back a response in a voice that wasn't mine, a wet, rattling trill, in the marrow. I hadn't asked it, but it answered anyway. The sound was cavernous, as if the voice were echoing from the very center of the earth. This morning, as the first sliver of gold cracked the horizon, I decided to troubleshoot the logic of my own subconscious. I started a flowchart in my head to map the mystery. If the recording was a dream, then the voice was a phantom. If the voice was a phantom, then the phantom was a guest. If the guest was a guest, then I must find the host. The crane swayed, a gentle lurch to the left, and the metal floor groaned like a weary giant. I felt a sudden weight against the glass of the front window. It wasn't a bird or a piece of debris. It was a texture of a rhythmic, pulsing pressure that seemed to push against the pane from the outside. I looked out and saw a section of the outer girder covered in a thick, translucent membrane. It looked like the skin of a giant fruit, but it moved. It rippled like water disturbed by a stone. I reached out a hand, and the membrane pulled back, revealing a section of the entity. It was a long grub, the size of the entire hallway of a skyscraper, winding its way along the steel beams. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Instead, it possessed a series of shimmering, iridescent plates that shifted like scales on a fish. Its body was the color of bruised plums and wet copper, and it moved with a slow, agonizing grace. It didn't have eyes, but it had a series of vibrating pores along its spine. I realized then that it wasn't just moving, it was listening. It was responding to my heartbeat. Every time my heart gave a heavy thud, the grub would contract, its plum-colored skin tightening. It mistook my internal rhythm for a mating call. It was trying to synchronize its own existence with mine. I sat back in my chair, my pulse quickening as the grub began to spiral upward, moving from the girder into the cab. It didn't crawl so much as it flowed, a river of muscle and slime. The cab grew humid, the temperature rising as the entity's mass displaced the air. The smell of ozone and old moss filled the small space, thick enough to coat the back of my throat. I began the flowchart again to process the growing dread. If the grub is the lever, then the heartbeat is the song. If the heartbeat is the song, then the silence is the death. The grub reached the center of the cab and began to coil around my torso. It was heavy, its weight pressing the air out of my lungs. Its skin was cool and felt like damp velvet against my skin. It didn't have the usual frantic energy of an insect. It was deliberate. It moved with the confidence of something that knew it was being adored. It pressed its segmented body against my chest, right over my ribs. I could feel its pores vibrating against my skin, a low-frequency hum that vibrated in my teeth. It was waiting for the next beat. I held my breath, trying to steady the rhythm. I wanted to be still. I wanted to be a steady metronome for its affection. But the more it coiled, the more it seemed to demand. It wasn't just hugging me, it was consuming the rhythm. I could feel my heart slowing down, as if the grub were drinking the very electricity of my pulse. The flowchart looped in my mind, spinning faster as the pressure increased. If the heartbeat is the song, then the silence is the death. If the silence is the death, then I am becoming the grub. The recording on the dash suddenly flickered to life without me touching it. It played my most recent sleep talk from the night before, but this time, the voice was different. It was deeper, more resonant. It whispered, "Is it enough?" I hadn't asked the question, but the grub had felt the need to answer. It tightened its grip, its plum-colored plates overlapping like a suit of armor. The hum became a roar in my ears, a physical weight that seemed to pull my very consciousness toward the center of its mass. I realized that it wasn't just looking for a mate, it was looking for a permanent anchor. It wanted to turn my heartbeat into its own forever. I closed my eyes and felt the last of my energy drain into its velvet skin. The crane stayed still, suspended in the dawn light, a lonely island in the sky. The grub stopped vibrating and settled into a final, heavy curve. The silence returned, heavy and absolute. I opened my eyes and saw the grub's tail end twitch once, then go still. It had won the rhythm. I felt my own heart give one final, hollow thud, and then it stopped entirely, leaving the grub to pulse with the ghost of my last beat. The borrowed silhouette. The air inside the bunker tasted of recycled oxygen and old concrete, a heavy, metallic flavor that seemed to coat the back of my throat. We were supposed to be in the bunker for 48 hours, a standard Cold War drill designed to simulate the end of the world. My companion, Elias, sat opposite me on a reinforced steel bench, his knees pulled up to his chest. The silence was thick, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the ventilation fan. Then, the smart home system, integrated into the bunker's walls by some modern luxury, flickered to life. A soft chime echoed, and the overhead LEDs pulsed a warm amber. No one had touched the console. I looked at Elias, who was staring at the corner of the room where a shadow seemed to thicken. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Before I could answer, the lights shifted to a harsh, clinical white. Then, without a command, the lights dimmed to a deep violet. It felt as if the house were breathing with us, reacting to a presence we couldn't see. That was when I first noticed it. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense, but a shape that occupied the space between the walls. It didn't have a permanent form. It was a mimic, a thief of movement. It stood near the storage crates, its body slightly blurred at the edges, looking like a smudge of charcoal on a canvas. It suddenly lunged forward, mimicking my exact posture, shoulders hunched, chin tucked, hands resting on my knees. It held the pose with a strange, vibrating intensity, as if it were trying to memorize the muscle memory of my spine. I felt a prickle of unease. "It's copying you," I said, my voice sounding small in the vast vault. The lights flickered rapidly, responding to the entity's growing agitation. It shifted again, suddenly mimicking Elias's slumped, weary lean. It moved with a fluid, liquid grace, transitioning from my posture to his in a single, sweeping motion. It didn't have a face of its own, but rather a surface of iridescent scales that shifted color like oil on water. It had 3 distinct joints in its limbs, allowing it to fold itself into shapes that felt almost impossible for a human body. As we sat there, the smart home feed began to go haywire. The lights started to pulse in a rapid, staccato rhythm, turning from white to a bruised plum color. The entity moved to the center of the room. It began to cycle through postures rapidly. It sat, then stood, then crouched, then reached out, all in a blur of motion. It was sampling us. It took my reach, Elias's slouch, and the way we both tilted our heads to the side. "It feels like it's trying to find itself," Elias remarked, his voice trembling slightly. "Like it's a blank page waiting for us to write on it." The entity suddenly froze. It stopped its cycling and settled into a posture that was entirely new, a bizarre, asymmetrical crouch where one arm reached over its head while the other tucked under its chin. The lights turned to steady, piercing gold. For a moment, the bunker was still. Then, the entity began to move toward us. It didn't walk, it glided, its body rippling like a curtain of silk in a breeze. It stopped just inches from Elias. It mimicked his wide-eyed expression perfectly, even though it had no eyelids. It was a perfect mirror of his surprise. Then, it turned toward me. It didn't just copy my posture, it copied the way I was holding my breath. The lights turned a dull, morning blue. I realized then that the entity wasn't just copying our bodies, it was stealing our essence. It was trying to become us. It says we grew up side by side, the entity seemed to project. It didn't speak with a voice, but the smart home system translated its intent into a synthesized hum. The lights pulsed in time with a thought. It moved closer, its iridescent scales shimmering under the blue glow. It reached out a three-jointed limb and touched Elias's shoulder. The lights flashed white. It then moved to me, its touch light as a feather. You were there for every step, the entity hummed. The lights began to cycle. Through every color in the spectrum, faster and faster, until they were a blur of iridescent light. The entity began to grow larger, its body expanding to encompass more of the room. It began to mimic both of us at once, its left side mirroring Elias, and its right side mirroring me. We were symmetrical halves of a single, borrowed creature. The hum of the bunker grew louder, a low vibration that shook the floorboards. The lights settled into a steady, neutral white. The entity stood tall, its body perfectly balanced between our two forms. It looked at us, its surface reflecting the bunker walls like a polished pearl. Then, it did something unexpected. It stopped mimicking us entirely. It stood perfectly still, a masterpiece of borrowed grace. The lights dimmed to a faint, ghostly gray. You are my foundation, the entity hummed for the final time. The lights flickered once and died, leaving us in the heavy, silent dark. In the silence, I felt the entity shift. It didn't move toward us, but it moved into the space just behind my head. I felt its three-jointed arm rise, not to copy me, but to reach for something else. I realized it wasn't just imitating our bodies anymore, it was preparing to take over our roles. The last thing I heard before the lights stayed off was the sound of it settling into my exact posture, so perfectly that for a second, I couldn't tell which one of us was standing in the center of the room. Then, the air inside the bunker tasted of recycled oxygen and old concrete, a heavy, metallic flavor that seemed to coat the back of my throat. The Guestbook of the Unfinished Room. I have spent 3 years avoiding the spare room at the end of the hallway. It is a graveyard of history, packed with the cardboard remains of a life lived before mine. The previous owner, a woman named Alara, left behind a chaotic museum of artifacts, stacks of linen-wrapped pottery, crates of yellowing sheet music, and rows of heavy wooden boxes that smelled faintly of cedar and old dust. Most people find a spare room to be a sanctuary, but for me, it was a heavy silence. I finally decided to tackle it on a Tuesday. I cleared a small patch of floor in the center, dragged a velvet chair into the middle of the clutter, and set a leather-bound guest book on a small stool. It was a simple thing, a gift I'd bought for myself to record the moments I spent in this house. That night, I sat in the chair and wrote a single entry, Day 1. The dust is heavy, but the silence is sweet. I blew out my candle, closed my eyes, and fell into a restless sleep. When I woke up at dawn, the room was bathed in a pale, watery light. I reached for the guest book, expecting to see only my own looping script. Instead, my breath hitched in my throat. Beneath my entry, in a script so delicate it looked like it had been etched by a needle, was a new line. The dust is heavy, but the silence is shared. My heart hammered against my ribs. I hadn't been here for anyone else to see. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor, and looked around the room. Every box seemed to have shifted an inch to the left. I felt a prickle of heat on the back of my neck. It wasn't a draft. It was the sensation of something being watched by something that didn't have eyes. I looked at the chair I had occupied. It was still warm, a faint indentation remaining in the velvet where my body had rested. Then I saw it. Tucked into the corner of the ceiling, just above the stool, was a cluster of appendages. They were not limbs of a human, nor were they the graceful legs of a spider. They were 12-jointed stalks, each tipped with a soft, fleshy pad. They were the color of bruised plums and looked like wet velvet. The entity was folded inward, its body tucked into a tight ball. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. It had a series of vibrating ridges that hummed with a low, subterranean frequency. It was folding its dozen legs inward, tucking them around the warm spot where my body had been just moments before. It was molding itself to the heat I had left behind. I realized with a jolt that it wasn't just sitting there. It was pressing its weight into the memory of my presence. I stepped back, my heel hitting a box of books. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet. The entity reacted instantly. It didn't move fast like a predator, but with a rhythmic, pulsing flow. It unfurled its legs, one by one, and reached toward the chair. The stalks didn't just point, they rippled like the surface of a pond. I watched as the center of its body, a cluster of glowing, amber-colored pores, pulsed in time with my own heartbeat. It wasn't a ghost. It was a physical inhabitant of the room, a creature that lived in the gaps of the old owner's life. It seemed to be drinking in the warmth of my lingering scent. I held my breath, afraid that a single exhale would cause it to lunge. It didn't. It simply stretched out, its velvet pads touching the fabric of the chair, and then it did something that made my skin crawl. It reached for the Guestbook. A single, thick stalk extended, the tip curling around the spine of the book. It pulled the book toward itself, and, for a second, the amber pores flared bright. Then, it moved with a sudden, fluid grace, wrapping its entire body around the chair like a crown of plum-colored silk. It was hugging the place where I had sat. I realized then that it wasn't just a guest. It was a collector. It took the heat of my body and the weight of my presence and folded itself into the shape of my experience. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the top of its velvet head. It was hummed against my palm, a vibration that felt like a distant beehive. For a moment, we were connected, the person who sat and the thing that stayed. I felt a strange sense of peace until the entity suddenly stiffened. The humming stopped. It unfolded its legs and turned its amber pores toward my face. It didn't move, but the weight of its attention was palpable. It was no longer just hugging the chair, it was beginning to mirror me. It reached out a third stalk and touched my chin, its velvet pad feeling like a cool, damp petal. Then it retreated back into its curled position, folding its dozen legs shut around the chair once more, as if satisfying its hunger for my warmth. I stood there for a long time, paralyzed by the beauty of it. Finally, I gathered my courage and walked toward the door. As I reached for the handle, I felt a tiny vibration in the air, a soft hum that followed me. I stepped out and closed the door, shutting out the spare room. I sat on the floor in the hallway, my ears ringing with the silence. I looked at the door, knowing that inside, the entity was still there, holding the warmth of my body in its plum-colored grip. It wasn't just a creature of the room anymore. It was a creature of my seat. I stayed in the hallway for a long time, listening to the house breathe. Then, from behind the door, I heard it, a soft, wet sound of something shifting. It was the sound of the entity adjusting its weight, perfectly molding its dozen legs to the exact shape of my spine. The smile of the last tenant. I was hired to oversee the final night of the Oakhaven feed mill, a hulking timber and iron structure that had ground grain into dust for nearly 80 years. It was supposed to be a quiet affair, a simple matter of inventory and a final inspection before the machines were sold for scrap. The air inside always smelled of toasted wheat and old oil, a heavy, comforting scent that felt like a physical weight on my shoulders. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the mill felt less like a workplace and more like a hollowed-out ribcage waiting for a heart to beat inside it. I sat in the foreman's office, a small wooden cubicle cluttered with ledger books, listening to the settling of the beams. Every hour, a low groan would vibrate through the floorboards, as if the building were exhaling. Then, around midnight, the first sound of movement came from the loft, a rhythmic, wet thrumming, like a thumb tapping against a piece of damp velvet. It wasn't the sound of a machine. It was the sound of something deliberate. I stood up, my flashlight cutting a path through the hanging dust, and followed the noise. It led me toward the main silo, where the last tenant had lived. He was a recluse named Elias, a man who had spent decades living in the rafters, supposedly carving wooden figurines from the excess grain. When Elias passed away 3 months ago, his face was found frozen in a permanent, wide grin that had caused his neighbors to call him the Joyful Hermit. On that final night, I found a figure standing by the central axle. It didn't move at first. It stood with its back to me, its posture stiff and upright. It was wearing Elias's face, but not in the way a mask does. It was a physical displacement. The skin was stretched taut, the cheeks bulging slightly as if something were trying to push outward from beneath the surface. Then it turned. It wasn't just the face that caught me, it was the way the light hit the mouth. In the deepest creases of its smile, the corners where the lips met the chin, there was a pool of true dimness. It wasn't a shadow cast by a light, it was a lack of light, a velvety void that seemed to drink the beam of my torch. It was as if the smile was a doorway into a deeper, quieter room. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. The entity didn't have the usual wide-eyed stare of a ghost. Instead, it had 3 distinct, heavy folds at the edge of its grin. These folds didn't just sit there, they pulsed. They were deep, velvety pits of navy blue gloom that seemed to ripple like water when the entity breathed. I expected it to speak, or to lurch forward, but it simply stayed there, its smile widening. The dimness in the creases began to leak outward, dripping like slow-motion ink onto its chin. It was a heavy, weighted joy, a smile that felt like it had been holding back a secret for a century. I took a step back, and the floorboard beneath me let out a sharp crack. The entity reacted instantly. It didn't walk, it unfolded. It moved toward me with a series of smooth, gliding motions, its body swaying like a pendulum. As it got closer, the dimness in its smile grew. It started to spill over the edges of its lips, pooling in the center of its face like a small, dark lake. I could feel the temperature drop, the wheat scent of the mill being replaced by the smell of damp earth and old silk. It reached out a hand, not a long, elegant thing, but a broad, flat palm with rounded edges. It didn't touch me at first, it just hovered near my cheek. The dimness began to crawl. It wasn't just on its face anymore, it was migrating. It felt like a cool, velvety weight pressing against my skin, a soft tugging sensation as if the smile were trying to pull my own face into its orbit. I realized then that it wasn't just wearing Elias's face. It was hungry for the expression. It was a collector of mirth, a reservoir of satisfaction that had run dry and was now seeking a new vessel. I saw the way the creases of its smile deepened until they were almost circular, 3 perfect wells of shadow. I tried to speak, to ask if it was friendly, but the words were swallowed by the sheer gravity of its presence. It leaned in, its forehead almost touching mine. In that moment, the dimness surged, flooding my vision, turning the mill into a world of velvet and shadow. The entity opened its mouth wide, not to reveal teeth, but to let the dimness pour out like a slow, silent waterfall. I felt my own mouth begin to stretch, my cheeks aching as the muscles pulled toward the corners. My own smile began to deepen, the skin between my lips stretching until it felt like it might tear. The entity pulled back, satisfied, and the dimness retreated into its folds, settling back into those 3 heavy creases. It stood there for a moment, perfectly still, its face a masterpiece of lingering joy. Then, with a sound like a soft intake of breath, it stepped back into the shadows of the loft. I stood alone in the center of the mill, the silence heavier than before. The dimness was still there, lingering in the air like a mist, and I could feel the new creases forming on my own face, permanent and aching. I walked out of the mill into the cool night air, my legs feeling heavy, my head spinning. I sat on the porch of the nearby house and looked at my reflection in a bucket of water. My mouth was still curved upward, my cheeks still pushed high by the phantom weight of the entity's gift. I realized I could no longer relax my jaw. The smile had fused into my skin, a permanent souvenir of the last night. I looked back at the mill, where the dimness sat waiting in the rafters. I realized that while the entity had left, it had left a piece of itself behind in the way I moved. I reached up to touch the corner of my mouth, feeling the new depth of the fold. It wasn't just a look of happiness anymore, it was a physical weight. As I closed my eyes, I felt the dimness in my own smile begin to pull, a slow, heavy tide of shadow that refused to let the corners of my lips drop, even as my heart felt entirely hollow. The sleeper in the steel ribs. The wind doesn't just blow against the relay tower, It screams against the corrugated metal skin, turning the structure into a hollow flute of ice. We were 3 stories up, suspended in a geometric cage of iron, while the storm outside erased the world in a blur of white and cobalt. Inside, the air smelled of ozone and damp wool. I sat on a crate, watching the frost crystals crawl across the floorboards like tiny, frozen spiders. Beside me, my nephew, Leo, was huddled in a thick parka, his breath coming in rhythmic puffs of steam. He wasn't looking at the snow. He was looking at the heavy oak door of the storage closet, which stood slightly ajar. It was a mundane piece of furniture, filled with spare cables and heavy copper reels, yet Leo seemed to be eavesdropping on the silence behind it. "It's still breathing," he whispered, his voice barely cutting through the hum of the electricity. I laughed, the sound vibrating in my chest. "It's just the wind, Leo. The tower is vibrating." He shook his head, his hair damp with melting slush. "No, it's the thing inside. It's moving when we aren't looking." I didn't believe him until the first true lull in the gale occurred. For 10 seconds, the howling ceased and the tower became a tomb of absolute stillness. In that silence, I heard it, a wet, sliding sound, like a heavy velvet curtain being dragged over smooth stone. Then, a soft thump. I looked at the closet. The door hadn't moved, but the handle gave a tiny, microscopic twitch. "It moved," Leo said, his eyes wide. "It's trying to find its footing." I squinted at the gap. There was nothing but shadow. "It's just your imagination," I said, though my own heart gave a traitorous leap. We sat in silence for another minute, the electricity crackling overhead. Then, the wind returned with a vengeance, and the sound of sliding vanished. When the noise resumed, Leo grabbed my sleeve. "It's awake now," he insisted. "It's looking at us." I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. The thing in the closet wasn't a ghost, I told myself. It was just a trick of the light. But then I noticed the dust. A thin layer of soot coated the floor, and right in front of the closet door, a single, perfect line of dust had been swept away, as if something had stepped out and then retreated. "How can it move when we're watching?" I asked. Leo pointed a small finger at the shadow. "Because it's shy. It only dances when you blink." He was right. Every time I blinked, the closet felt heavier, more occupied. It was as if the entity was a master of the transition, a creature of the in-between moments. To test him, I told him to close his eyes and count to 5. 1, 2, 3. He began. As he reached 4, I felt a sudden shift in the air pressure. A low, melodic hum vibrated through the floorboards, a sound like a cello string being plucked underwater. Then a sudden click. I opened my eyes. A small, iridescent scale, the color of a bruised plum, lay on the floor directly in front of the door. The entity had poked its head out for a fraction of a second and then pulled back. "It's getting bolder," Leo whispered. The middle of the storm hit then, a blizzard so fierce it muffled our voices. We were forced to huddle together, but the closet seemed to pulse with a rhythmic heat. It felt like a giant heart was beating behind the wood. Every time the wind reached a crescendo, the door would swing inward by an inch, then snap shut with a sharp crack. I finally gathered my courage. I stood up, my knees trembling, and reached for the handle. "Let's see what you are," I murmured. I pulled the door wide. For a moment, there was nothing but the organized chaos of cables. Then, the monitor of the mind shifted. The entity emerged. It wasn't a creature of flesh and bone, but of texture and motion. It had a body like a polished river stone, draped in shimmering, overlapping feathers of copper and teal. It had no face in the traditional sense, but instead possessed a wide, horizontal slit that glowed with a soft, amber luminescence. It had 4 limbs that didn't have joints. They flowed like poured wax, ending in rounded pads that made no sound when they touched the ground. It didn't walk so much as it rippled across the floor. It moved with a strange, undulating grace, its feathers chiming like tiny glass bells. It hovered in the center of the room, its amber slit pulsing. It was beautiful, but there was something deeply wrong about the way it existed. It didn't have a shadow. It seemed to swallow the light around it rather than cast it away. "Hello," I breathed, the word feeling heavy in the cold air. The creature didn't speak. It simply vibrated, a low frequency that made my teeth ache. It moved toward me, its waxen limbs stretching out. It touched my hand with a rounded pad, and for a second, I felt a sensation of profound, ancient loneliness. Then, as if remembering its primary rule, the creature suddenly stiffened. It pulled itself back into the corner of the closet, folding its limbs inward until it was a compact sphere of copper feathers. It became still, perfectly motionless, as if it were a statue of brass. The storm outside died down to a whisper. I looked at the creature, then at Leo, who was staring with his mouth open. "Is it done?" Leo asked. The creature didn't move. It waited. I realized then that it wasn't just hiding, it was observing. It was waiting for the moment I would turn my back. I sighed, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. "Yes," I said. "It's finished." I reached out to close the door, but just as my hand touched the wood, the creature's amber slit flickered. It didn't move, but the glow changed from a warm amber to a sharp, piercing violet. I realized with a jolt of terror that while it was still, its pulse was accelerating. It wasn't resting, it was preparing. I closed the door, but as I turned to walk back to our crate, I heard the sound of a single feather scraping against the wood from the inside. The door didn't move, but the sound was unmistakable. It was waiting for me to stop looking at it. I sat down and took Leo's hand, but I didn't look at the closet again for the rest of the night. I knew that every time I blinked, it was moving a little bit closer to the edge of the door. The guest of the Junction. The rain didn't fall so much as it hung in the air, a thick, silver veil that turned the rural train platform into a lonely island of wet timber and rusted iron. There were no tracks for miles in either direction, yet the platform remained, a ghost of a station waiting for a train that had forgotten its destination. I stood under the eaves of the wooden shelter, my breath blooming in small clouds. It was the first night. The silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic drip of water hitting the platform. Then I heard the first step. It wasn't a heavy thud or a light click, it was a muffled, wet slide, like a piece of meat being dragged across velvet. Out from the shadows of the far end of the platform emerged a figure. It was human-shaped, but its anatomy felt like a puzzle solved by someone who hadn't quite mastered the logic of the pieces. Its head sat firmly where its right shoulder should be, protruding outward like a decorative bulb. Its torso was elongated, and its arms were arranged in a zigzag pattern, with one elbow pointing toward its chin and the other pointing toward its feet. It didn't walk so much as it pivoted its entire body with each movement, swinging its head shoulder in a wide, sweeping arc. It stopped 10 feet from me. It had no face in the traditional sense. Instead, its head was a smooth, iridescent surface that rippled like oil on water, yet it possessed a single, wide mouth that stayed open in a perpetual O of soft surprise. It took a step forward. Its movements were jerky, lacking the fluid grace of a living creature. I felt a jolt of electricity crawl up my spine. "Hello," I whispered, my voice sounding thin against the steady downpour. The figure didn't move, but its mouth pulsed. It waited. Then it spoke. Its voice wasn't a single tone, but a layered harmony of 3 different pitches, all vibrating from that single open mouth. "Hello, Elias." My heart skipped. I hadn't introduced myself. I hadn't even thought of my name in the silence of the station. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The creature lurched forward, its head shoulders swinging toward me. "I am the one who waits," it replied. "I am the one who sits." It gestured toward the empty space beside me. It wasn't an invitation to a chair, for there were no chairs, but a gesture of intent. It sat down, or rather, it folded its zigzag arms inward and settled its weight onto the wetwood. It looked at me with its oil-slick head and then at the empty space before it. "Would you like to dine?" it asked. It didn't have a plate or a table. It simply held out its left hand, which featured 3 knuckles instead of 2. A small, glowing orb of amber light appeared in its palm. "Eat," it commanded. I reached out, my hand shaking. As my fingers touched the light, it tasted of toasted honey and old memories. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. The creature watched me, its mouth twitching. "Is it enough?" it asked. "For now," I said. The creature nodded, its head shoulder bobbing with a heavy, wet thud. Then, the rain changed. It didn't stop, but the rhythm shifted. The shadows on the platform grew deeper, and the wooden planks beneath my feet began to hum. The creature didn't move, but its body began to change. The oil on its head started to swirl faster, turning from amber to a deep, bruised purple. "You are full," it remarked. "But are you finished?" I looked at it, confused. "I am still here," I said. The creature smiled, a movement of its entire torso. "Then we shall begin the second night." The platform seemed to stretch, the far end disappearing into a mist so thick it swallowed the light. The creature stood up, its head-shoulder rotating 360 degrees. "Do you hear the train?" it asked. I listened. There was no roar of steam, no clatter of wheels. There was only a low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from the ground itself. "I hear it," I whispered. "It is coming." The creature leaned toward me, its face surface rippling like a disturbed pond. "It carries what is left of the first night." Suddenly, the ground beneath us shuddered. A massive, invisible weight seemed to pass over us, a ghost of a train made of wind and echoes. The creature reached out and touched my chest with its three-knuckled hand. "Hold your breath," it whispered. The air grew cold, so cold that my eyelashes frosted over. The creature's body began to stretch, its zigzag arms lengthening until they almost touched the ground. It was no longer just a guest, it was becoming part of the station itself. Its head-shoulder leaned down, its oil-slick face inches from mine. "Tell me," it asked, its voice now a mere vibration in my skull. "Do you remember the train?" I blinked, trying to see the ghost of the carriages. "No," I admitted. "I only see you." The creature let out a sound that was half sigh, half whistle. "That is the tragedy of the station. We are the memory of the journey, and you are the witness of the rest." It pulled back, its body shrinking until it was a small, compact knot of limbs and head. It sat down again, its head-shoulder pointing toward the mist. "The train has passed," it said. "The dining is over." I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me, a heaviness that pulled at my eyelids. The rain began to soften, turning into a fine mist that smelled of wet stone and ozone. The creature stood one last time, its body swaying. It looked at me, and for a moment, the oil on its head settled into a perfect, glassy sheen. "You may leave now," it said, "or you may stay for the third night." I looked at the empty platform, then back at the creature. "Will you still be here?" I asked. The creature didn't answer immediately. It took a step back, its head-shoulder swinging into the shadows. "I am always here," it replied. "I am the one who waits. I am the one who sits." I took a step forward, then another, moving toward the edge of the platform where the mist began. I turned back one last time to see the creature. It was perfectly still, a sculpture of misplaced parts in the silver rain. It didn't move, but as I turned to leave, I heard its voice one last time, drifting from the darkness behind me. "Don't forget to bring your appetite." I walked into the mist, and as I did, I felt a cold, wet pressure on my shoulder, as if the creature had reached out to touch me one last time, even though it was standing several feet away. The Knuckle-Walker of Pen 42. The stockyard was a graveyard of iron and silence, a sprawling expanse of mud and timber where livestock usually defined the atmosphere. At midnight, however, the cattle were gone, leaving only the skeletal remains of the pens to hold the heavy, humid air. I stood in the center of the yard, my flashlight cutting a lonely path through the gloom. The silence wasn't absolute. It was a heavy, pressurized quiet that seemed to push against my eardrums. I had come here to find peace, but as the wind died down, the silence began to feel less like a lack of sound and more like a held breath. Every pen was empty, every gate was latched, and the mud was smooth as glass. Then, the first notification chimed on my phone. It was an emergency weather alert, a crisp, digital chirp that felt intrusive in the stillness. The screen glowed, announcing a sudden, localized frost. Then came the second, more specific, a microburst of wind hitting the northern quadrant. The third alert was the strangest. It didn't describe the weather, it described a location. Current anomaly detected at 442 North Orchard Lane. That was my house. It was a bizarre, unnecessary detail for a general weather app, but it made my pulse skip. I looked toward the far end of the stockyard, where the fence lines converged into a single point. A sound emerged from the shadows, a rhythmic, heavy thud. It wasn't the steady pace of a human walk. It was a wet, meaty slap, like a fist hitting a damp sponge. I swung my flashlight toward the noise. For a moment, there was nothing but the rusted wire of the fence. Then it appeared. It moved with a strange, rolling gait, its body hovering just inches above the mud. It didn't have legs in the traditional sense. Instead, it moved on massive, bulbous knuckles that looked like polished river stones, each one large enough to be a fist on its own. These knuckles were joined by thick, corded tendons that pulsed with a dull, rhythmic twitch. The entity had no visible face, only a broad, leathery expanse of skin that resembled a weathered drumhead. It didn't have a nose or a mouth, but a series of vertical slits along its brow that vibrated as it moved. I froze. The creature didn't rush. It rolled forward, its knuckles striking the ground with a muffled thump squelch. It moved with a deliberate, predatory grace, the large joints of its hands rotating in a way that suggested it was constantly unfolding. It was about the size of a large hound, but its silhouette was wider, more expansive. As it entered the pool of my flashlight, I saw the texture of its skin. It was pitted like a golf ball, each crater holding a tiny bead of moisture that caught the light. It didn't have eyes to look at me, yet I felt the weight of its awareness. It was navigating the yard not by sight, but by the vibration of my heartbeat. Another alert chimed. Anomalous pressure rising at 442 North Orchard Lane. The creature stopped. It didn't just pause. It pivoted on its front right knuckle, the movement so smooth it looked like a hinge opening. It was closer now, perhaps 20 feet away. I could smell it, a scent of wet earth and old copper. It began to rotate its body in a slow, dizzying circle, its knuckles sweeping the mud in wide arcs. It was tasting the air, or perhaps the space I occupied. I took a step back, my boot making a sharp crunch on a piece of grit. The creature reacted instantly. It didn't run, it lunged. It threw its weight forward, its knuckles striking the mud in a rapid-fire sequence, propelling it toward me like a falling stone. I ducked, and it passed over me, its broad, drum-like head nearly clipping my shoulder. It landed on the other side, the mud splashing against my shins. It stayed there for a heartbeat, its brow slits vibrating with a low, hummed frequency that I felt in my teeth. Then it began to move again, but the rhythm had changed. It was no longer rolling, it was skipping. Each knuckle hit the ground and then propelled the creature upward, creating a series of small, rhythmic pops. It was circling me now, closing the distance. I felt a sudden, cold pressure on my left side. The creature had moved into my peripheral vision. It was so close I could see the individual pits in its skin. It didn't have a head to tilt, but it leaned its weight into my space, its knuckles hovering just above the grass. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was thick with the creature's presence. I realized it wasn't hunting me for food. It was studying the way I reacted to it. It was learning my shape. Then, the final alert arrived. The screen flickered, the letters appearing one by one with a haunting, mechanical click. Subject arrival confirmed at 442 North Orchard Lane. The creature stopped its circling. It stood perfectly still, its knuckles tucked slightly inward. It raised its frontmost knuckle, pointing it directly at my chest like a heavy, blunt finger. I waited for it to strike, for it to lunge, for it to move. But it remained motionless, as if it were waiting for me to acknowledge it. I reached out a trembling hand, my fingers hovering just an inch away from its leathery brow. I wanted to touch the skin, to see if it was warm or cold. Just as my fingertip made contact, the creature let out a sharp, pressurized hiss from its brow slits. It didn't pull away. It leaned into my touch, the weight of its massive knuckle pressing against my palm. Then it did something unexpected. It didn't retreat or pounce. It simply settled into the mud, its knuckles splaying out in a wide, flat plane, as if it were unfolding a map. It lay there, perfectly still, as if it were a fallen boulder. I stood there for a long minute, my hand still resting on its skin. The stockyard was silent again. The frost had arrived, coating the iron pens in a thin, white powder. I realized then that it wasn't a visitor. It was a resident of the house, a guest that had simply wandered out into the yard to meet me. I turned to walk back toward the gate, my shadow stretching long behind me. But as I reached the fence, I heard it. A soft, wet thump from behind me. I didn't turn around, but I felt the shift in the air. The creature hadn't stayed in the center of the yard. It had moved to the very edge of the fence, standing just behind my heels. I could feel its weight, a heavy, solid presence. I looked down at the mud and saw the last thing it had done. It had left a single, deep indentation in the dirt, a perfect circle from its primary knuckle and a small trail of moisture leading directly to where I stood. I took one final step toward the gate, and then I felt a cool, leathery surface brush against the back of my neck. It wasn't looking at the yard anymore. It was watching the back of my head. The end. Subscribe for more horror stories, and make sure to like.